Happy fourth period, everyone. We are Yeza and Yumin, and our senior project explores the cultural difference in drug control and jurisdictional practices. Specifically, we're looking at the locality of justice. So, these are four main sections of our presentation. First, we'll briefly define the nature of law, and then we'll look at how cultural backgrounds shape drug control policies across different continents. Third, we'll analyze how jurisdictional practices are influenced by cultural hierarchy. Finally, we'll conclude with our findings on how justice is locally constructed. To begin with, we must ask, what is law? On the surface, it is a set of ground rules that every citizen must follow, along with consequences for those who do not abide by them. However, law doesn't exist in a vacuum. The social context of nation, its history, values, and cultures is deeply woven into its legal code. As we'll show you, while the concept of justice is universal, the practice of justice is deeply local. Identical acts can lead to vastly different outcomes depending on where you are on Earth. So let's start with our first case study, the cultural backgrounds of drug control policies. We'll compare approaches in Asia, America, and Europe. First, let's look at Asia, specifically South Korea. East Asian culture places a high value on community responsibility. This is reflected in Narcotics Control Act, as you see here. The law is strict. It applies the personality principle, meaning Korean citizens can be punished even for drug use committed abroad. This strictness demonstrates that the government values deterrence and social responsibility over individual choices. However, there is a recent shift. With the rise of synthetic drugs, while punishments remain strict, the government is slowly expanding the treatment programs, beginning to recognize addiction as a health issue alongside being a crime. And moving to Singapore, we see an even more intense focus on order and stability. Singapore's Misuse of Drug Act includes extreme deterrence, such as caning and the mandatory death penalty for trafficking. So, why such harsh measures? It stems from a communitarian tradition where social stability takes precedence over individual freedom. The logic is that strict laws guarantee the safety of the majority. However, like Korea, Singapore is also recently pairing these strong deterrence with rehabilitation programs to help offenders reintegrate. Now, across the ocean to the United States, the US has a history defined by war on drugs, which focused heavily on punishment and mass imprisonment. This era was marked by severe sentencing disparities, particularly between crack and powder cocaine, which created significant racial inequality. However, we're witnessing a shift from retributive justice to restorative justice. Recent reforms aim to reduce these sentencing gaps, and there is a growing trend toward cannabis legalization. The U.S. is currently struggling to balance its punitive path with these modern health-based reforms. And to the north, Canada offers a different model. In 2018, Canada legalized cannabis nationwide, the first G7 nation to do so. But it is important to understand the motive. This wasn't about total freedom, but it was a public health model. So Canada's goal is the harm reduction. By regulating the market, they aim to eliminate the illicit trade and manage quality rather than simply punishing the users. It reflects a welfare state model where regulation is preferred over criminalization. And Europe provides the strongest example of harm reduction, led by Portugal. In 2001, facing a severe HIV and heroin crisis, Portugal took a radical step. They decriminalized personal possession of all drugs. Instead of prison, people caught with drugs appear before disusation commissions composed of legal, medical, and social experts. They define addictive as patients, not criminals. And the result? A sharp decline in overdose death and HIV infection rates, providing that addiction can be effectively managed as a medical issue. And finally, we have the Netherlands. Their policy is defined by pragmatism. They use a policy of tolerance known as jeu beleid. While drugs are technically illegal, the prosecution is waived for personal use to serve the public interest. This allows for the famous coffee shop, which separates the market for soft drugs like cannabis to hard drugs to minimize harm. It is a constant balancing act between tolerance and control, ensuring that enforcement focuses on serious crime rather than individual users.
Looked at drug laws and how each country reacts differently to the same kind of crime, which, as you can see, drug trafficking or the possession of it. We will move on to our second main topic, which is how cultural hierarchy influences jurisdictional practices and the actual sentencing in court. So we'll talk about how the concept of hierarchy and the power dynamic within a culture can influence the jurisdictional practices. In South Korea, we see a phenomenon we call the hierarchy of justice. Statutory law is strict. Embezzlement of over 5 billion won, or 350K US dollars, carries a minimum sentence of 3 years or to life sentence. However, the judicial reality is often different for social elites or taebol. There is a frequent sentencing practice known as the 3-5 rule for more fortunate cases: 3 years of imprisonment suspended for 5 years of probation. Statistics show that despite high embezzlement amounts, the average prison term is under 3 years and probation rates are around 35%, so it's about a third of the convicted. Scholars link this to Korea's high PDI, or power distance index. In a culture with high PDI, there is often a systematic compliance towards authority figures, leading to lighter punishments for elites. And you can probably understand that Korea historically and politically, there has been a lot of strict power dynamics enforced into our everyday life. So let's look at another case where this is not evident. Let's compare this to Denmark. Denmark has a very low power distance index, 18 compared to Korea's 60. Danish culture is oriented towards equality, where the statutory law in Denmark is less intense than in Korea. They are applied more equally. So consequently, similar white-collar crimes result in much shorter and proportionate imprisonment or fines for everyone, not just the elite. The judicial system here is less subjective towards authority figures. The focus is on applying the law equally, reflecting a society that does not accept high inequality of power. Our final system here case study is Japan, where we see the influence of shame culture and the concept of law or harmony. Japan has an exceptionally high confession rate of over 98% for first-time criminals. Surprisingly, the suspension of indictments is also very high, over 60%. Why is this so? The mechanism here is based on restoring harmony to the culture. If an offender confesses and shows remorse, the system often grants tolerance to prevent further public shame and deems that public shame is often enough, punishment and aid reintegration. Prosecutors often only indict cases with a certain conviction, suspending others to maintain social order and social harmony without public conflict. So, in conclusion, our research shows that the law is not just a set of rules, or neither is it objective. From the strict deterrence in Asia to the harm reduction models in Europe, we see that identical acts face vastly different fates based on location. Also, we can see that cultural forces like the community focus in Korea or communitarianism in Singapore and the hierarchy and shame cultures of East Asia deeply influence how justice is actually delivered in our everyday life. Ultimately, while the principles of justice may be universal, the practice of justice is always local. So that was our conclusion, and thank you for listening.